Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to dive into some ethical waters?
Always up for a deep dive, especially when it comes to ethics.
This time, we're tackling applied behavior analysis, or ABA for those in the know. Specifically, all those ethical considerations that come with the territory.
A territory that comes with a lot of responsibility.
Exactly. And to guide our deep dive today, we have Chapter 6 of Ethics for Behavior Analysts. So buckle up. We're about to unpack real cases, real dilemmas, all those situations that really put a spotlight on just how crucial ethical conduct is in this field.
And what I find fascinating is how the field's ethical guidelines have evolved right alongside ABA itself.
So no ancient scroll of ABA ethics then?
Not quite. The book actually points out that ABA is relatively young compared to other helping professions, which plays a big role in how we understand those ethical boundaries today.
So how does that, being a newer field, impact the conversation about ethics?
Well, it's like anything new, right? You're still figuring things out as you go. And in the beginning, there weren't many formal ethical guidelines in ABA.
So no rule book back then?
Not really. Early practitioners were often working with individuals who hadn't had much success with other therapies, those who had kind of been let down by other approaches. And their focus was really on relieving suffering, improving lives. They were driven by this desire to make a real difference.
Trying to do the right thing, but without a map. I can see how that could lead to some tricky situations.
Yeah.
So what were some of those turning points, those moments that really pushed for a more defined ethical structure?
Well, there's one moment that really stands out, a 1959 study titled The Psychiatric Nurse as a Behavioral Engineer. This study is considered a landmark moment, really the start of applied behavior analysis as we know it today.
Okay, so a defining moment for sure. But you mentioned evolving ethics, right? So it wasn't a done and dusted situation after that?
Not at all. It actually took some time and, unfortunately, some high-profile scandals for the need for consistent ethical conduct to become impossible to ignore. That push for standardization, for clear ethical guidelines, that's what led to the creation of the Behavior Analyst Certification Board.
Or the BACB, as I'm sure we'll be calling it.
Exactly. They published their first official code of ethics in 2014.
Things starting to fall into place. But hold on, the book keeps emphasizing how the code is constantly being updated.
And that's what's so interesting about it. It's not static. It's a living document, always adapting. What I find particularly interesting about the latest revision, the one from 2021, is the shift toward prescriptive guidance. It's not just about what behavior analysts should avoid doing, but what they should be actively doing to uphold the highest ethical standards.
A more proactive approach.
Exactly. And that makes a lot of sense when you consider the work itself. Behavior analysts are often working with vulnerable populations. The stakes are high.
Absolutely. So let's break down some of those ethical principles laid out in the book, shall we? Chapter 6 covers 16 elements of professional responsibility.
16. We definitely can't get to all of them today.
Sadly not. So what are some that really make you stop and think, the ones that really stand out?
Well, I think it's important to start with the fundamental one, being truthful. That's the cornerstone of ethical practice, not just in ABA, but in any profession, really. The code even dedicates a whole section to it, 1.01, being truthful.
Seems pretty straightforward. Why dedicate a whole section to being honest?
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how often there's pressure, even in small ways, to bend the truth. The book gives a great example. Imagine you're running late for a client meeting. You hit the snooze button one too many times.
Happens to the best of us.
Right. So you could tell the truth, apologize, and maybe risk appearing unprofessional or...
Blame it on traffic.
Exactly. It's a small ethical lapse, right? But it illustrates how easy it is to slip into those habits and how those small lapses can snowball. The book actually talks about a case where a behavior analyst was let go from their job after being asked to give honest feedback about company morale.
Ouch. That's rough.
It is. It makes you think, was the company behaving unethically in that situation?
That's a tough one. It also speaks to how important it is for behavior analysts to find an organization that aligns with their own ethical compass. Speaking of aligning with values, how does the code address those situations where a behavior analyst's personal beliefs might be challenged by a client's situation, their background?
That's where 1.07 comes in, cultural responsiveness and diversity. This goes way beyond basic tolerance. It's about behavior analysts actively cultivating a deep understanding and respect for the cultural values and practices of their clients, even, and this is key, even when those values are different from their own.
So not just agreeing to disagree, but really understanding where your client is coming from and letting that inform your approach.
100%. To understand this through a true ABA lens, the book actually quotes B.F. Skinner, whom many consider a founding father of behavior analysis. Skinner defined culture as observable behaviors, which when you think about it, highlights how crucial it is to understand the context behind those behaviors, the why behind the what.
Okay, so how does that play out in practice? How do you apply that understanding of cultural differences?
It takes a lot of listening, being open to learning new perspectives, and of course, self-reflection. To give you a concrete example, the book discusses a case involving a 10-year-old child who's expressing a female gender identity. This case really digs into how a behavior analyst should navigate the situation when the parents are uncomfortable with their child's identity, all while making sure that child's well-being is the #1 priority.
That is such a relevant case right now, and it really highlights the need for that constant self-reflection, especially when facing these complex situations. It makes you think about implicit bias, those things we might not even realize are influencing how we perceive things.
You're spot on. That self-awareness is critical. And thankfully, the code addresses it directly with a new principle. This is 1.10, awareness of personal biases. This principle acknowledges that we all have biases, and those unconscious biases can really influence how we interact, not just with clients, but with colleagues as well.
I can only imagine how crucial that is in a field like this. Does the book offer any examples?
Absolutely. One that really stands out is case 1.10a, where a supervisee was triggered by a client's family history of trauma. And the case explores whether this is a personal bias or a legitimate reason for the supervisees to be reassigned to a different case.
So it's not always a clear-cut answer, but it sounds like being able to recognize those potential biases and then seeking guidance when you're unsure, that's key. This really emphasizes the need for support systems for behavior analysts because we all need help navigating those ethically challenging situations, right?
Absolutely. And that actually leads perfectly into our next principle, 1.13, coercive and exploitative relationships. The BFCB added this to the code because of the power dynamics inherent in this field. You have supervisors, trainees, clients who rely on practitioners. These dynamics unfortunately create potential for abuse.
I can see how those lines could get blurred. Are there any specific situations in the book that illustrate this?
Definitely. One that comes to mind is when companies pressure supervisees into providing in-home therapy services in exchange for the supervision hours they need to be licensed.
Wow.
It's a classic example of exploiting someone's vulnerability in this case, the supervisee's need for those hours for personal gain. The code makes it very clear. That kind of behavior is not acceptable.
And that's a perfect example of how the ethics code is designed to protect everyone involved, not just clients, but practitioners as well.
Precisely. Ethical practice has to be built on a culture of respect and accountability at every level.
Well said. So far, we've covered some pretty intense situations, firing, potential exploitation. What about those more everyday situations that can still feel ethically tricky? Like what about giving or receiving gifts? That's got to be a tricky one to navigate.
It is, you're right, and the code actually addresses it head-on. It's 1.12, gifts. The updated guidelines allow practitioners to accept small gifts, under $10, but it's an area where you need to tread carefully. It can be a slippery slope.
I can see how. Where do you draw the line? Like, when is it just a kind gesture, and when does it cross over into, like, a boundary violation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It really comes down to context and intent. The book gives this really interesting example. It's case 1.112c involving a Moroccan family who want to show their appreciation by sharing a home-cooked meal with their therapist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's a gesture of hospitality, very culturally significant, but it also brings up all those questions about professional boundaries and, maybe even conflicts of interest.
So how do you balance navigating those cultural nuances while also honoring the ethics code?
Honestly, it's about clear communication and having solid policies in place within the organization. Everyone needs to be on the same page. In that specific situation, the behavior analyst would need to be very upfront with the family about the guidelines on gifts, but, in a way that's also sensitive to their cultural norms. It's a delicate balance, that's for sure.
Sounds like a tightrope walk.
It can be. And speaking of potentially tricky relationships, romantic relationships have to be even more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. That's a whole other level.
It is, and that's why the code draws a very firm line in sand with 1.14, romantic and sexual relationships. These relationships are completely prohibited between practitioners and clients, stakeholders, trainees, supervisees, everyone involved, really. No exceptions.
Which makes sense. You're there to provide a service, and those personal relationships just muddy the waters, complicate the therapeutic relationship.
Exactly, and potentially put people in a very vulnerable position. Maintaining that professional distance is non-negotiable. To really illustrate why these boundaries are so important, the book shares an experience from a behavior analyst who was subjected to unwanted advances from her supervisor.
Ugh, that's awful.
It is. And it's a stark reminder of why those boundaries are there and why it's so important to speak up if those lines are ever crossed, for your own well-being and for the integrity of the field itself.
Couldn't agree more. You have to advocate for yourself in those situations. And that actually leads into another crucial aspect of ethical conduct that we wanted to discuss, self-reporting.
Ah, yes. Self-reporting. 1.16. Accountability takes center stage here. The code states that behavior analysts have a duty to report themselves to the BACB if they engage in any conduct that violates the code of ethics. And here's the thing, even if that conduct occurs outside of work—
Wait, hold on. Even stuff outside of work, that seems like a whole other level of, well, accountability.
It is, and for good reason. It's about maintaining public trust in the profession. Think about it, a doctor's actions outside the hospital, those still reflect on their profession, right? Same principle applies here. We're talking about people's lives, their well-being. Maintaining that public trust is paramount.
I get it. It's about holding yourselves, holding each other to the highest standard possible. Does the book give an example of this?
There's one that comes to mind. It's a tough one, that's for sure. It's case 1.16a. It's about a BCBA, that's a board-certified behavior analyst, someone who's met all the requirements for licensure. And this BCBA is struggling with whether or not to report their supervisor, whose behavior has become erratic, potentially even dangerous.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, right? Wanting to do right by your supervisor, but also having to consider the potential consequences of not speaking up. It's about the clients, too, their safety, their well-being.
That's a heavy one, and it really highlights how important those ethical guidelines are, especially when you're in a situation where there's no easy answer.
You got it. And that's what this whole deep dive into ethics keeps bringing us back to, recognizing those morally ambiguous situations and then, having the courage to make the ethical choice. And then this is important, even when it's difficult. Having those ethical codes to refer back to, those guidelines that clearly lay out what needs to happen, that's an invaluable tool for behavior analysts.
Absolutely. Having that solid foundation to rely on makes all the difference. So we've covered a lot of ground here with these 16 elements of professional responsibility, from truthfulness to gift-giving to navigating those complex relationships. It's a lot to process. It really highlights how important those ethical guidelines are, especially when you're facing a situation with, no easy answers.
Exactly. It's like having that compass to guide you, especially in those ethically uncharted waters. And I think that's what's been so important about today's conversation. It's not about memorizing a list of rules. It's about really understanding the principles, the why behind the what.
So true. And I think we did a pretty deep dive into that why today. We've explored how these ethical principles actually play out in real-life scenarios, ranging from those everyday interactions to the really, really complex dilemmas.
And through those examples, those real cases from the book, we see how these principles aren't just abstract ideas. They are the foundation of trust, of integrity in ABA. They're about protecting clients, ensuring accountability, and ultimately upholding the very values of a profession that is dedicated to improving lives.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about approaching this work with a constant awareness of those ethical responsibilities, knowing that every choice you make, every interaction, it matters.
And that awareness, that commitment to ethical conduct, it's something you carry with you everywhere, not just in your practice, but also in how you advocate for the field as a whole. It's about being that force for positive change, always pushing ABA to be the very best, most ethical version of itself.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the ethical landscape of applied behavior analysis, remember, this conversation, it's just the beginning. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to be the most ethical practitioner you can be. Because ultimately, that's how we create a better future, not just for ABA, but for the individuals it serves.